A few days ago, my dad called me a faker right at the family dinner table. He said I was putting on a show so everyone would fuss over me. I expected an argument, our usual back and forth where we spar with logic and volume. But my body had other plans. I could hear my own breathing like it was coming through a plastic tube, see my fingers trembling, feel the words around me turn to cotton. When the air stopped reaching the end of my lungs, the silence in that room was deafening. And my dad's been quiet around me ever since. With my illness, it's always the same problem. It's inconvenient to explain. There are no casts, no bruises, no visible injuries to make it obvious. It's more like a badly tuned radio. On the outside, everything looks fine, but inside, there's static in every moment. During the day, it shows up in small ways. By the third flight of stairs, my pulse spikes. In the bus, my throat catches. In the grocery store, my head suddenly feels like it's sinking, and I lean against the pasta shelf like I'm comparing brands. You can live like this, but it takes discipline, constant monitoring, an inhaler in your pocket, and knowing exactly where the red lines are. And more than anything, it takes people who believe you when you say what's happening. My dad is one of those "I'll believe it when I see it" types, and even when he sees it, he looks for the catch. He grew up in a world where weakness was either laziness or drama. Pull yourself together, stop listening to your body. Go for a run, it'll fix itself. You know the type. Over the years, he learned to say it with softer words, but the meaning stayed the same. If you can't lift a cement bag, it's because you never tried hard enough. I've always clung to numbers, discharge papers, doctor's recommendations, morning peak flow readings, oxygen saturation charts that dip into the danger zone. To him, these were toys. To me, they were proof of life. Mom and I made a silent pact to avoid yelling matches with him, to save our energy. But family dinners were always the stage for his skepticism. That Saturday night started quietly. Chicken soup, celery salad, soft music in the background. I'd already used my inhaler, knowing that kitchen smells and warm, humid air could sometimes set me off. There was a faint pressure in my head, but nothing alarming. Dad was telling one of his classic stories about how nobody used to complain back in his day. His usual overture. My nephew chuckled. Mom gave me that "don't engage" look, and I wasn't going to, until he said the sentence that flipped something inside me like a lock turning. "You just like the attention." He said it out loud, in front of everyone, with the tone of someone who thinks they've finally laid down their trump card. Dad's sentence hung in the air like smoke. You just like the attention. I felt the sting before I even processed the words. Everyone's eyes shifted toward me, some with curiosity, some with that awkward look people get when they know something ugly just got thrown into the middle of the table. My fork was still in my hand, halfway to my mouth. I thought about firing back, explaining that attention isn't what I want when I'm trying not to black out in the frozen foods aisle. But before I could speak, my chest tightened. Not the slow kind of tightness that warns you hours ahead. This was instant. A cold, dense grip under my ribs. I put the fork down. The room kept moving. The clink of silverware, my nephew whispering something to my sister, Dad refilling his glass. And then, as if someone turned down the volume, the sound started to fade. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, trying to hide it. If I drew attention now, it would only prove his point. My throat felt smaller. I swallowed and it caught halfway down, like there was a lump that wouldn't move. Mom noticed first. She leaned in, her hand brushing my arm. "Are you okay?" she mouthed. I gave a tiny nod, but she didn't buy it. Dad was mid-story about some winter in '82 when he worked double shifts with a chest cold and never missed a day. He looked straight at me as he said it. That smirk, it was almost daring me to contradict him. And then my vision blurred. Not all at once, but like someone smudging the edges. I could still hear him talking, but it was underwater now. I pushed back my chair. It scraped the floor, and finally, the room quieted. "What now?" Dad's voice, half irritation, half mockery. I opened my mouth to answer, but the air didn't make it all the way in. My body jolted in tiny spasms as I tried to pull a breath. Someone stood up. I think it was my sister, and Mom's voice broke into panic. "Get her inhaler now." Dad froze. For the first time that evening, he had nothing to say. The next 30 seconds were a blur of movement and muffled shouts. My nephew's sneakers squeaking on the tile. The bright orange inhaler being pressed into my palm. My fingers slipping on the cap because they were trembling so hard. 2 puffs. I closed my eyes, willing the medicine to work. Air came back in ragged, uneven bursts. My hands found the edge of the table to steady myself. When I opened my eyes again, the room was dead silent. No clinking silverware, no side chatter. Just Dad, standing there, staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. And in that frozen moment, I realized something. It wasn't just my breath that had stopped. It was his certainty. But that was just the beginning of the shift in our family. The next morning, the house was unnervingly quiet. Normally, Dad's coffee routine was a soundtrack. The grinder, the clink of his spoon, the low hum of the news channel he swore he didn't actually listen to. But when I walked into the kitchen, he was already at the table, hands wrapped around a mug like it might anchor him. He didn't look up. That alone told me something had shifted. Dad wasn't the avoid eye contact type. "Morning," I said, my voice scratchy. He gave a short nod, but didn't speak. Mom glanced at me from the stove with that tight-lipped look she used when she was silently telling me not to push. I sat down, pulled the oxygen saturation monitor from my pocket, and clipped it to my finger. The numbers flashed, 92%. Low enough to still feel like my body wasn't my own. I jotted it into my notebook, the one I've kept for years, tracking every flare, every trigger. And that's when I noticed it. The notebook was slightly out of place. I keep it stacked under a couple of other papers on my desk, but last night it had been moved. I looked at Dad. He was still staring into his coffee. "Did you read this?" I asked, tapping the notebook. No answer, but the corner of his jaw twitched. It was a small reaction, but I knew that look, the same one he'd get when he was caught eating from the pie before dinner. Only this time, it wasn't sugar he'd taken. It was pages and pages of my private record, the evidence he'd always brushed off as exaggeration. Part of me wanted to feel relieved. Maybe seeing the data would make him understand. But another part of me knew him too well. If he'd read it, he wasn't just absorbing facts. He was dissecting them, looking for holes, angles, anything to prove his point. "Must have been scary last night," Mom said quietly, breaking the tension. Dad finally looked up. It was surprising. Surprising. That's the word he chose. Like I'd pulled a rabbit out of a hat. Surprising. I repeated, feeling heat rise in my chest. "Because you thought I was." "I didn't say that," he cut in quickly. "No," I said, holding his gaze. "You said it to everyone else." Silence. He stood, rinsed his mug, and left the kitchen without another word. That was when I felt it. The shift wasn't just about last night's episode. Something else was brewing. He wasn't defending himself, but he wasn't apologizing either. It was like he was holding on to something, waiting. And if I've learned anything about my dad, it's that his silences are never empty. They're loaded. I stared at the notebook on the table, the slightly bent corner where someone had flipped through too fast. And I couldn't shake the thought. If he read it once, he might be planning to use it. I just didn't know when, or how, he'd play it. 2 days later, I got my answer. It happened at my aunt's house, of all places. She was hosting a small get-together. Nothing fancy, just coffee, pastries, and her attempt to keep the family connected. I almost didn't go, still feeling shaky from the episode. But Mom insisted it might ease the tension. We'd barely taken off our coats when I heard it. My aunt, leaning in toward my cousin across the kitchen island, whispering in that way people do when they want everyone to hear. She keeps a whole diary about it. Charts, numbers, everything. You'd think she was training for the Olympics, not just catching her breath. The words slammed into me. My notebook. I didn't even have to look at Dad to know where she'd gotten that information. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just a slip. It was deliberate. I stepped closer. "Where did you hear that?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. My aunt froze, eyes darting toward Dad. He had the audacity to shrug. "It's not a secret, is it? I just told her you're thorough." "Thorough," I repeated. My pulse was already climbing. "You went through my personal health records and made it into a joke for the family?" He shook his head like I was overreacting. "No one's laughing. We're just concerned." But I caught the quick smirk from my cousin, the way my aunt suddenly found her coffee cup very interesting. Concern? No. This was a performance, and I was the unwilling act. I felt that familiar constriction in my chest, not from the illness this time, but from rage. The same tightness, the same fight for air, but with heat behind it. "You call me dramatic," I said, my voice low but steady. "And now you're passing around my private medical information like gossip." His jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. And that was my confirmation. The silent suspicion I'd had since I saw that bent notebook corner was real. He'd read it, memorized it, and armed himself with it. Not to understand me, but to undermine me. In that moment, I realized something worse than him not believing me. He believed me enough to weaponize the truth. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of half-finished pastries and stilted small talk. But I caught every sideways glance, every half-smile. My health, the thing I fought to manage quietly, was now a family talking point. When we finally left, Mom squeezed my hand so hard it almost hurt. It was her silent way of saying, "I saw what happened. I'm on your side." But all I could think was, if he'd already crossed this line, what would stop him from going further? The answer came faster than I expected, and it left no room for doubt about his intentions. It was the very next evening when the scale of it hit me. Mom and I were in the living room, half watching some rerun on TV, when my phone buzzed. A message from my friend Clara. "Hey, weird question. Why would your dad tell Mark from work about your condition?" I froze. Mark was her coworker. I had never met him. Before I could type a reply, she sent another. "He said you've got a breathing thing, and that it's more about anxiety than anything serious." He was laughing. The remote slid out of my hand. My ears rang. This wasn't just family gossip anymore. Dad was taking my private health information to strangers. And not just sharing it, but twisting it into something that made me look fragile, unstable, or worse, dishonest. I showed Mom the messages. She went pale, then muttered, "Oh, for God's sake," and stood up, pacing. "How many people has he told?" I asked. She didn't answer, which told me she already had an idea. I went upstairs, straight to his office. He was at his desk, scrolling through something on his laptop. "Why are you telling random people about my health?" I demanded. He didn't even flinch. "It's not random. Mark's a good guy. He's into running. I thought maybe he'd have tips for you." "Tips?" I laughed, sharp and humorless. "You told him it's all anxiety, that I'm making it worse in my head." He leaned back in his chair, his face settling into that maddeningly calm expression. "You overthink everything. A little exposure could help you toughen up." Exposure. As if my privacy was a phobia I needed to get over. I scanned his desk and spotted my notebook again, lying open under a pile of bills. Pages dog-eared. My handwriting circled in pen that wasn't mine. "You're marking things?" I said, pulling it toward me. Sure enough, little comments in the margins. "Seems exaggerated. Pattern. Coincidence." Something broke inside me. This wasn't curiosity or misunderstanding. This was an investigation, my own father building a case against me in my own home. "You're trying to prove I'm lying?" I said. He didn't answer. Which was an answer. That's when it clicked. All the skepticism at dinner, the quiet stares, the way certain relatives suddenly acted like they knew better about my health. He'd been planting seeds everywhere. And in that moment, the stakes shifted. This wasn't just about me convincing him I was sick. This was about protecting my own name from a smear campaign run by my father. I closed the notebook slowly, my fingers trembling. "You have no idea what you've started," I told him. He just smiled faintly, as if I'd confirmed something for him. I didn't know it yet, but the pushback I was about to give him would ripple far beyond our house. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bent pages of my notebook, his pen marks, the smirk he wore when he thought he'd won something. I lay in the dark, torn between two instincts. One said to go nuclear, confront him in front of the same people he'd been talking to, throw his betrayal right back at him. The other said to disappear, stop sharing anything, go silent, lock every door he'd ever opened into my life. The trouble was, either option played into his narrative. If I exploded, he could call me unstable. If I withdrew, he could say I was sulking because I'd been caught. I pulled the notebook from my nightstand and flipped through it slowly. Every number, every oxygen reading, every note about symptoms. This was my reality in ink. And now it was evidence in his trial against me, a trial I never agreed to. By 2 a.m., I was sitting at my desk, laptop open, fingers poised over the keyboard. My first instinct was to start writing an email to the whole family, explaining everything, laying out the facts. But then I stopped. Facts hadn't changed his mind before. No, I needed something that didn't just tell the truth, but made people feel it. Something undeniable. I thought about the times my symptoms hit hardest, heavy scents, heat, certain cleaning chemicals. If I could document an episode from start to finish, not just a chart, but the sound of my breathing, the color draining from my face, it would be harder to dismiss. But the thought made my stomach twist. Recording myself mid-attack felt invasive, humiliating. The idea of anyone watching me at my most vulnerable made me want to crawl out of my own skin. And yet, wasn't that exactly what he'd already done? He'd paraded my private health in front of others, stripped away the boundaries I tried to keep. Maybe taking control of the narrative was the only way to stop him from controlling it himself. I started making notes. Keep phone charged and within reach at all times. Record timestamp and location before each clip. Keep inhaler visible in frame for context. Store files in a locked online folder only I can access. The plan felt cold, clinical, and still, my hands were shaking as I typed. I hated that it had come to this. That I was strategizing like I was up against an enemy, not my father. By dawn, I decided. I wouldn't announce anything, wouldn't tip him off. I'd let him think I was still the same target he could casually undermine. But every time he got close to crossing another line, I'd have proof ready. When I finally crawled into bed, exhaustion dragging me under, one thought anchored me. If he wanted to turn my life into a story he could control, I'd make sure it had an ending he didn't see coming. The chance to put that plan into motion came sooner than I expected, and in front of an audience neither of us could ignore. The opportunity came 3 days later. We were at my cousin's birthday lunch. Big table, too many chairs crammed together, the kind of gathering where conversations overlap in a chaotic hum. I'd been keeping my distance from Dad, sticking to small talk with the others. He was in his element, laughing too loudly, leaning back in his chair like the center of the room. And then, right as dessert was being served, I caught it. Yeah, she keeps a whole log of her episodes, he was telling my uncle, chuckling like it was an inside joke. Even writes down what she eats, like it's connected. It was the same script as before, but this time, I was ready. Without saying a word, I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and opened a video. It was from 2 nights ago, the moment an attack had started while I was folding laundry. The shaky breath, the wheeze, my hand fumbling for the inhaler. The date and time were stamped in the corner. I set the phone down in the middle of the table, right next to the cake, and hit play. The chatter died within seconds. All you could hear was my ragged breathing filling the speakers. My uncle froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. My cousin's eyes flicked between the screen and Dad. "This," I said calmly, "is what you've been turning into a punchline." Dad's face changed. Not guilt, not exactly, but something tighter. Like he'd been caught mid-sentence and didn't know how to finish it. "It's not," he started, but I cut him off. "You've told people it's just in my head. That I'm exaggerating. That's my lungs collapsing, Dad. Does that look like attention-seeking to you?" The silence that followed was almost satisfying. Mom put her hand on my shoulder, a silent show of support. My uncle cleared his throat and muttered something about needing to make a call, sliding out of his chair. The rest of the table avoided looking directly at either of us. Dad finally said, "I didn't mean." "You meant exactly what you've been saying for weeks," I said. "Only now everyone here knows what it looks like when you're wrong." I ended the video, slipped the phone back into my bag, and picked up my fork like nothing had happened. For the rest of lunch, Dad was quieter. No jokes, no anecdotes. Just occasional glances in my direction, like he was trying to calculate his next move. And for a moment, I thought maybe that was it. Maybe seeing it, hearing it, had finally shut him down. It felt like a win. A small one, but enough to let me breathe without that constant tension in my chest. I should have known better. When my dad goes quiet, it's not surrender, it's strategy. The quiet didn't last. It never does with him. 4 days later, I was leaving work when my phone lit up with notifications. 3 missed calls from Mom, 2 texts from Clara, and 1 from an unknown number that simply read, "You should know what your dad's saying about you." By the time I got home, I felt that familiar buzz of dread under my skin. Mom was in the kitchen, pacing. She had a printed sheet in her hand. "What's that?" I asked. She hesitated, then handed it over. It was a post from a local community Facebook group, the kind where neighbors complain about potholes and lost cats. Only this post wasn't about cats. It was from my dad. Full name, smiling profile picture. The caption read, "Looking for recommendations for a real respiratory specialist. My daughter's been given every test in the book, but still insists she's ill. Thinking maybe it's time to address the anxiety side of it." The comments were worse. People chiming in with advice about tough love, others swapping stories about relatives who milked illnesses for sympathy. And there, buried halfway down, someone had posted my name, full name, and a link to a photo from my cousin's birthday. I felt my stomach drop like an elevator cut loose. He's making it public, I said, barely recognizing my own voice. Mom rubbed her temples. I told him it was wrong. He said he's just crowdsourcing help. Help. That's what he called it. Turning me into a conversation piece for strangers to dissect. I went upstairs before I said something I couldn't take back. My hands shook as I scrolled through the comments again. Each one a little needle pushing the same message. Maybe she's making it up. The worst part? Some of them were people I actually knew. Old neighbors, family friends. They'd read his post, and now had a version of me in their heads that I couldn't erase. That's when it hit me. The video at the birthday lunch hadn't shut him down. It had pushed him to find a bigger audience. I sat on my bed, the notebook in my lap, and felt this cold clarity wash over me. This wasn't just about him not believing me anymore. This was about my reputation, my credibility, being chipped away one concerned comment at a time. I flipped to a fresh page and started writing names. Every person who'd commented, every person I knew had heard the story from him. Not because I planned to confront them all, but because I needed a map of the damage. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a line from Scene 5's late night planning replayed. Don't just tell the truth. Make them feel it. Only this time, I wasn't thinking about one or two relatives. I was thinking about everyone he'd reached. And I knew exactly how to make sure they all saw the truth, whether they wanted to or not. I thought I was ready for damage control. I wasn't. By the end of the week, the Facebook post had made its way into places I never expected. Group chats with people I hadn't spoken to in years, a thread on a local subreddit, even a passing comment from a coworker who tried to play it off as just curious. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. The questions were always wrapped in fake concern. So, how are you doing? Or did they ever figure out what's really going on? The emphasis on really was the tell. It wasn't just my dad's voice anymore. It was a chorus. One night, Clara came over with takeout, thinking company might help. I tried to eat, but every bite felt heavy. She finally said, "You know, some people just won't believe anything until it happens right in front of them." That's when it hit me. My worst fear wasn't that people wouldn't believe me. It was that they'd believe him forever, no matter what proof I had. And that thought, it broke something in me. I went upstairs to grab my inhaler and caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. Pale, shoulders hunched. Someone who looked more like the fragile caricature he'd been painting than the person I knew I was. It was like I was becoming the story he told. I sat on the edge of my bed, the notebook open in front of me, and for the first time since this started, I wondered if maybe it would be easier to just stop fighting. Let him have his narrative. Disappear from the groups, from the conversations, from the family dinners. But then I saw a page I hadn't looked at in months, an old entry from the night I ended up in the ER. Oxygen mask strapped to my face, the nurse's handwriting still scribbled across the discharge papers. I remembered the way my chest burned, the sound of the monitor beeping. That was real. That was me. And no one could take that away unless I let them. That's when the fog started to lift. If my dad wanted an audience, fine. I'd give him one, just not the performance he expected. I'd show the truth, raw and undeniable, and I'd make sure it reached the same ears he'd poisoned. It wouldn't be pretty. It wouldn't be comfortable, but it would be mine. I closed the notebook, slid my phone into my pocket, and took a deep breath. The plan from Scene 5 had been about defense. This would be offense. And by the time I was done, my dad wouldn't just stop talking about my illness. He'd wish he'd never brought it up at all. It happened at the next Sunday family gathering. Not everyone was there, but enough. Aunts, cousins, my parents, and, crucially, a few of the people who had commented on that Facebook post. I'd chosen this on purpose. I waited until after lunch, when everyone was lingering in the living room with coffee. The TV was on low. Conversations were scattered. My dad was in his usual spot, arm over the back of the couch, posture relaxed, like the room belonged to him. "Before we wrap up," I said, standing near the TV, "I want to show you something." Phones came out. Attention shifted. Dad's smirk flickered, just for a second. I connected my phone to the TV and hit play. The first clip was from the birthday lunch, the one I'd shown before, but this time, it was followed by more. Different days, different triggers. One in the grocery store, one in the laundry room, one on the porch after coming in from the heat. My breathing shallow, my face paling, timestamps in the corner of every frame. The room went silent except for the audio. Wheezing, gasps, the mechanical click of my inhaler. No commentary. No embellishment. Just reality, playing out in front of them. When the last clip ended, I left the final frame on the screen. Me, eyes closed, inhaler in hand, date stamped from just 3 days ago. This is what my dad's been calling anxiety, I said, keeping my voice steady. This is what he's been laughing about, sharing with people who've never seen it for themselves. I let the silence hang. If you still think it's made up, that's your choice. But you won't be able to say you didn't know. I looked at him then, directly. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. No quip, no dismissal, just nothing. And in that nothing, I saw it. The realization that the control he'd had over the narrative was gone. Aunt Linda shifted uncomfortably. My cousin cleared his throat. Even the ones who'd been defending him before couldn't meet my eyes. Mom broke the tension. I think we're done doubting, don't you? No one answered, but the room's energy had shifted. I disconnected my phone, put it in my pocket, and sat down. I didn't gloat, didn't press it further. The point had landed. The rest of the afternoon was strangely calm. Conversations picked up, but not with the same easy flow. Dad stayed quiet, his gaze fixed on some point in the distance. When we left, he didn't say goodbye, just a curt nod. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was suffocating without warning. The damage he'd done couldn't be undone overnight, but now, it was his reputation on the defensive, not mine. In the days that followed, something strange happened. The silence stuck. No more posts. No more secondhand concerns filtering back to me. No more casual digs disguised as jokes at the dinner table. My dad didn't apologize, not directly, anyway, but the absence of his usual commentary was its own kind of admission. People who'd seen the video at the gathering started reaching out privately. A couple of cousins sent short messages. Didn't realize it was like that. Sorry. Even Aunt Linda, who'd laughed along before, sent me a rambling voice note about how she never meant any harm. And while their words didn't erase the weeks of humiliation, they did something important. They shifted the balance. I wasn't the one under scrutiny anymore. The conversation had changed from whether I was telling the truth to whether my dad had crossed a line he couldn't step back from. Mom noticed it too. One evening, she sat down across from me at the kitchen table, tea in hand. You know, she said, he's been quieter with me too. I think you scared him a little. Good, I replied, surprising myself with how calm it sounded. I wasn't aiming to scare him, but I'd learned something through all of this. When someone builds a narrative about you, they're not going to abandon it because you ask nicely. You have to show them a truth they can't unsee, even if it's uncomfortable for you to share. The videos weren't easy to record, and I hated that I'd been pushed to that point. But they gave me something I hadn't had since this started: control. Eventually, the Facebook post disappeared. I didn't ask who took it down. I didn't need to. Our relationship hasn't gone back to what it was before, and honestly, I don't think it ever will. Trust doesn't grow back overnight. But there's a different kind of peace now. We talk about neutral things: the weather, the yard, what's on sale at the hardware store. And if my breathing falters at the table, he doesn't comment. He just passes the water. Maybe that's as close to an apology as I'll get. As for the rest of the family, the ones who were quick to smirk or exchange knowing glances when he called me dramatic, they're quieter too. Some have become more careful with their words. Others avoid the subject entirely. Either way, the gossip pipeline isn't running like it used to. It's not perfect. I still get the occasional sideways look, and I still carry that notebook everywhere. But now, I carry something else too. The knowledge that I don't have to let someone else's version of my life drown out my own. And if my dad ever forgets that, I have the footage. If you've made it this far, you probably understand why I had to tell this story. It's not just about one bad moment or one difficult relationship. It's about what happens when someone decides their version of you is more important than the truth. Maybe you've been there yourself. Maybe someone's twisted your words, your reality, or your struggles into something they could use against you. And maybe you've learned, like I did, that asking them to stop isn't always enough. Sometimes, you have to take the story back into your own hands. I'm not saying it's easy. It's uncomfortable, it's messy, and it can leave you feeling exposed. But if there's one thing this whole experience taught me, it's this: letting someone else control the narrative will cost you far more than setting the record straight. So, have you ever had to prove the truth to someone who didn't want to believe it? Share it in the comments. I'd like to hear your side. And if you want more real stories like this, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.